Hi YouTube! Today I'm going to be doing a video tutorial on how to replace the front brake pads on your 8th generation Honda Civic. Now this particular Civic is a 2009 Honda Civic sedan, but the procedure for the coupe version is done in a very similar manner. For added safety, use some wood blocks or some large bricks and chock both rear wheels to prevent the vehicle from rolling back. Next, open up the hood and verify that the brake fluid level in the brake fluid reservoir is at a low enough level where when you retract the piston back into the caliper that you don't cause the brake fluid to overfill. If this fluid reservoir is too full, you can just use a plastic spoon or some type of suctioning device to remove the excess fluid to allow the brake fluid from the calipers to go back into this reservoir without overflowing. Locate the front central lift point on the car, which is located actually on this crossbeam here with the little hole. Now directly in front of this lift point is actually the radiator drain spigot here, so don't confuse this little empty hollow spot here with the actual lift point, which is on this engine support beam. Locate the front jack stand support points located directly behind the front mud flaps, and you'll see it by looking at there's a drop down tab in this location where a jack stand has a cutout where you can put this on. Now it's kind of covered in ice, so it might be a little bit difficult to see. Once you've done, place the jack stand on both sides of the vehicle, slowly lower the vehicle onto the jack stands. Using a 19mm socket, remove the front wheels from the car. Using a 12mm wrench or ratchet, remove the lower caliper mounting bolt. Flip the caliper away from the caliper bracket. Carefully remove the two front brake pads, paying attention to which pad contains the wear tab. Generally speaking, on most Hondas, this squeal tab here is located on the inboard pad, which is closest to the vehicle's engine bay. Using a C-clamp like this, retract the caliper piston back into the bore of the caliper body. Now, the reason why this piston is sticking out is that as a brake pad thickness begins to wear down, brake fluid is displaced inside this bore to push the piston out to make up for that wear. And so what we're trying to do here is just push this piston back in, because we will be installing a brand new set of brake pads on this vehicle. Now that was the main reason why we had to check the brake fluid reservoir level in the master cylinder before we proceed to push this piston back in, as you don't want the master fluid reservoir assembly to overflow with brake fluid. Turn the clamp in until the piston surface is flush with the caliper body right here. Now you'll notice here that the gasket, the dust gasket boot, is kind of bulging around this piston, and that's because air has actually made its way behind this boot. So we're going to just use a small screwdriver to gently pry away at this lip here to let the air out of that boot assembly. Using a screwdriver, ever so carefully pry between the piston and the rubber boot, and all you have to do is just have a flathead screwdriver this small to put in on the piston and this boot to relieve that air pressure that is preventing this boot from going back in properly. Now you don't want to tear this boot, because if you do, then you're going to have to replace it, and that essentially requires you to rebuild the caliper assembly at the same time. So you can tell I've relieved the air out, and now that boot sits nice and flush inside this piston bore alongside this caliper piston. Using that same flat blade screwdriver, let's give these pad slide shims here a thorough cleaning to remove all the corrosion that could hamper the free movement of the new brake pads. After everything's been scraped clean, give it a shot with some non-chlorinated brake cleaner, such as something like this. Next, we want to remove the lower slide pins for the caliper and then ultimately the upper slide pin to clean off the excess and old grease that may have begun to thicken up, preventing this caliper body from sliding properly on its bracket, which can lead to uneven braking, which could lead to warped rotors or unevenly worn pads. So again, that slide pin here is just below on this section here, and so I've just pulled it out and that's what it looks like. So the product I'm going to use here for the slide pin is called a Ultra Disc Brake Caliper Lube, synthetic lubricant. And it's purpose built actually for this exact reason. And so we're just going to give this a really thin coating of caliper lube. And then we're just going to carefully slide this pin back in until this rubber grommet goes over that groove on the slide pin. Now you might not be able to see it very well in this video, but basically what I do is I slide it in, push it in and out, making sure that this rubber boot, slides along with the pin and it's nice and smooth. To do the upper slide pin, we can actually just slide this entire caliper body out like this, and that's what that pin would look like. So same thing, we're just going to give this a good wiping like this, and just take some of our caliper lube and brush it on with a thin coat. Carefully slide this pin and caliper assembly back onto the body's bracket, making sure that this rubber boot here slides over those grooves on this pin, and making sure that you just give it a nice sliding action to make sure that nothing's sticking or binding. So what I've got here is the genuine Honda brake pads for this 09 Civic, and the part number for the front brakes is 45022-SNE-A00. Inside this box here we've got a whole mishmash of brake parts like this, and that can be rather daunting for someone to figure out which part goes where. And the easiest thing to do is that when you're working on your Civic, or any vehicle for that matter, always take a look at the old parts and then just select all the appropriate matching parts that go along with what you just removed. Now, so I now identified the inboard pad and the outboard pad relative to the old ones, but then there's also all these different shims here that the average person may not be able to understand where they go. Again, all you have to do is take a look at the old pads and see what shims are actually installed on each respective pad, and then just match it up. So I can tell here that based on the inboard pad here that I'm going to use this pad or this shim here like so, and then a outer silver shim that goes on top. And conversely, the outboard pad here looks like it has a single shim, so I'm just going to use one of these and stick it on like that. Now, before we actually install any of the shims, I want to use a product like this called the Loctite Disc Brake Quiet Spray. And basically, this is sort of a tacky spray that you spray onto the back side of your brake pads so that the shims and the pads themselves don't develop any type of chatter when you're applying the brakes. And you don't need a lot of it, you just need a really light spraying of it. And I have a tendency to just give each layer of the shims a quick light spray before I attach them onto the brake pads, as you're seeing here in the video. So now that we've got all of our pins and everything lubed up and cleaned up, we can go ahead and just install our pads in the same way that we've removed them. And so basically we've got our outboard pad here that doesn't have that anti-squeal, or sorry, that's wear indicator tab, and then our inboard pad that's got the wear tab here. Now, for those that are wondering if they removed a set of brake pads out that don't have this squeal tab on it, to know which side goes where, well, it's actually quite simple. Is that we know that the wear indicator tab is always on the inboard brake pad, right? And so what happens is that I just use the method of, if the car is rotating and driving, that the wheels will be rotating counterclockwise. And basically we want to put this wear tab squealer in line with how the rotor would enter the brake pad, which is in this direction. Therefore this tab should be at the top because the rotor is turning this way against the pad. Flip our caliper itself back down, and then just lining up that lower pin, we can then go ahead and reinstall our 12mm securing bolt to button up everything. Now, to tighten this lower bolt, I'm just going to use a 12mm wrench again, and I'm just going to hand tighten it and then snug it down a little bit more. The next step is to bleed that front brake caliper to remove any air that may have been introduced into the brake lines. But before doing so, we want to just reseat that brake piston against the back of our brake pads by pressing down a few times on this brake pedal as so. Next, we want to remove the brake caliper bleeding screw cap off of the bleeder like this, and then attach a small hose onto this nipple, and using a 10mm wrench, we're going to crack this valve open to begin bleeding the front brake line. Using a brake bleeder tool that looks something like this, we can now go ahead and open up our bleeder valve and begin stepping on our brake pedal a few times to remove the air out of the brake lines. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that you can actually build this little brake bleeder tool yourself by simply attaching a clear plastic tubing to the end of this nipple and then having the other end submerged inside some brake fluid. And the reason why it needs to be submerged in some brake fluid is that every time you release the brake pedal, it always inevitably sucks in a bit of fluid back into the caliper, and so having it submerged in the fluid doesn't allow air to be introduced back into the bleeder line, as we've got it set up here. Begin bleeding the brakes by giving the brake pedal about a quarter step or half step on the brake pedal. Now that I've pumped the brake pedal at least 7 or 8 times, I'm pretty confident that there's no air in the brake system, as I can see that there's no bubbles in the line and that the brake fluid, this tube here, is submerged in brake fluid, which also confirms that I'm not drawing air back in the system. Go ahead and close off your bleeder valve, and then now remove your hose, give your bleeder valve a good wipe, and replace the bleeder cap. Go ahead and top off the master cylinder fluid reservoir as required to bring the level back up to where it needs to be. Now, if you haven't worked on the other side of the front wheels yet, you might only want to fill this up halfway, but to never ever let the brake fluid drop below the minimum level line, as you could potentially be introducing air through the master cylinder reservoir into the brake system. Once the one side of the front brakes is complete, go ahead and repeat the same exact process for the opposite side. Reinstall the front wheel. When you've completed both sides of the front brakes and reinstalled the tires, don't forget to use a torque wrench set to at least 85 foot-pounds and tighten the bolts in a crisscross manner like this. When the tires have been properly torqued down, take the vehicle for a short drive and then re-torque the bolts a second time for safety. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.